In this video, I'm going to show you how to make this baguette style leather handbag. You can get the plans for this in the description below or on my website, norfolkhandmade.com. Let's get into it. The plans for this project include full-size drawings for each piece, and for the pieces that don't fit on a standard 8.5 by 11, I've included cut versions that you can paste together to get the full size. This laser has become an invaluable tool in my shop, especially when it comes to prototyping, because I can design all of my templates on the computer, export it, and have the laser cut it exactly as it's designed. It removes any error or variation in cutting these pieces by hand. If you are cutting all of these pieces by hand, the plans do include all the appropriate reference marks so that you know everything is going to line up. It also includes the 3.3mm stitch spacing that I use for all my projects. I started with my main panels and decided to pre-punch them before adding the lining. I realized after doing this that I probably should have added the lining and then punched all the way through, because now I'm going to have to glue the lining on and then punch it again. The reason I pre-punched this is because my lining edges are going to get skived out. Sometimes I've had issues in the past where the angle of the skive has actually caused issues with punching and getting the holes spaced correctly on the bottom side of the punch. This turned out not to be an issue because my lining is only 0.5 millimeter thick. Because the zipper is going to get stitched between the main panel and its lining, I need to pre-finish this edge before I install the zipper. I'm going to glue the lining flat down to the full main panel, leaving 1 inch measured down from the top to allow me to install my zipper between the main panel and its lining. I need to skive out the edges of the lining right out to 0 to reduce the thickness of the edge once this is glued on to the main panel. All these marks are noted on the plans. You can then trim your lining to its final measurements, and then we can skive out those edges. One thing to note about skiving this really soft, thin leather is that you need a very sharp skiving knife. If your skiving knife isn't sharp enough, then you're going to end up putting a lot more pressure on the leather, and in my experience, this soft, thin leather will stretch out, and then that will actually impact how it glues in place, because skiving out to 0 on your edge is not going to line up with your main panel. You'll see shortly, even though I cut this to the exact size of the main panel, I do have a bit of an overhang once this gets glued in place, and that was from this skiving that I stretched out the leather just slightly. This mark is my glue line so that I know not to add glue on the top portion of that panel. You'll see here I start messing with this edge because it's not lining up exactly, and I'm thinking I just glued it down wrong. So I go ahead, I peel it back, line up that edge, and then realize that I'm going to be left with the bulge in the middle if I do that. So I pull it back, line it up flat, and then just make sure everything is nice and smooth, and then I'm left with a little bit extra on the edge, which I will trim off. Once your glue has had time to set, you can trim the top portion of your lining to the final dimension. Sometimes the piece just simply doesn't fit in the laser, so you have to do it by hand. There are many methods I could have used to cut out these straps, but for me, measuring it and using my X-Acto blade is the most accurate. To ensure that I get an accurate cut, I actually add 0.5 millimeter to my measurement. That seems to account nicely for the blade width. I use the paper template to mark both ends, as well as the transition from the wide part to the narrow part of the strap. Whenever I have a straight line to cut that's longer than 2 or 3 inches, I always use a ruler to back up my X-Acto so that everything stays nice and straight. I use my paper template to mark out my stitch spacing. I only mark every 9th hole, which matches my largest iron size. If you're using a different stitch spacing than I am, I encourage you to check your spacing on your paper template before you start working on your actual leather. I added Velodon to the wide part of the strap to ensure that it isn't going to stretch out over time. Since the bottom thinner part is stitched in place, there's no worries that that portion of the strap is going to stretch out. With my reinforcement in place, I then added glue to my straps and their backing and got them all glued up. With the lining in place, I can now go ahead and pre-punch my straps. Our straps are now done and ready to be glued and stitched to the main panel. I use the needle to mark that center hole to make sure my strap is going to line up correctly, and then work it around the edge, and then put another needle into the opposite end at the top of the bag. Because the two ends of this strap overlap, we need to make sure that we stitch this properly. We're going to start by stitching the straps to the main panel. There are quite a few start and stop points on these straps, so I've included all of those within the plans. If you notice the two holes that are to the right of where I started my stitch, I've updated the plans so that that last hole now lines up with the corner of the main panel. This will make it a bit easier to understand where to start and stop your stitching. The plans include two strap lengths, the longer shoulder version, which is the one you see in this video, and a shorter one that's just meant as a handle. And never forget to hammer down your stitching. To make things a bit easier in the edge finishing department, I decided to pre-finish this edge before stitching the rest of the strap. It's easy to blend in the two sections after the fact, than attempting to edge finish this strap all at once. This is a new edge paint that I'm using for the first time. It's called Uniters, and so far I've been very happy with how this edge paint applies, how it sands, and how it takes heat. I find this edge paint also builds up its layers really well, and it dries extremely quickly. You'll also need to finish the very ends of these straps before we stitch them together. So after about 20 minutes, this first coat is completely dry. I can use the spatula tip on my creasing machine to smooth out that edge. After applying that bit of heat, I then use 600 grit sandpaper to really smooth it all out. If you look closely, you can see the variation in that surface. All the shiny lighter bits are the low spots. I need to sand down until that surface is a uniform color. Depending on how much edge preparation you did before adding your edge paint, you may or may not sand down through all of the first layer of edge paint. If you do, that's okay, because you need to build up a really nice flat surface before polishing off that last layer of edge paint. After that, I apply a second layer, and then it's the exact same process as I did before. Use some heat to smooth out that edge, sand it down, and then reapply another layer if necessary. To stitch our straps together, we're going to overlap the ends by 9 holes. I've included all the appropriate reference marks on the plans, so this will be easier to see once you have those plans downloaded, but overlap the first 9 holes on each side, glue those pieces together, and then we'll go ahead and get into the stitching part. To make sure everything stays lined up correctly, I'm going to use the needles to help with alignment. And I'll use binder clips to keep everything nice and secure while that glue sets. We're going to start our stitch run right where we finished off stitching on our straps to our main panel. To finish this off, you're going to back stitch to the second hole on the overlapping strap and then stitch across. This will secure the loose end of the top strap. To finish this off, you're going to feed the two ends of your thread through to the middle, tie off a double knot, and then snip that thread to length, and then the excess will just get held down once the other edge of that strap is stitched in place. And we can use that same process to finish off the inside of the strap. The zipper preparation on this one is pretty straightforward. You're just going to fold over the tape so that it sits perpendicular to the zipper teeth. To make sure this doesn't come apart before it's installed, I'm just going to melt the end. The other end of the zipper gets a little leather patch to cap it off. Because the zipper runs long and you're going to be able to see both sides of this leather patch, I'm going to double punch this so that each side is perfectly clean. If you want your zipper to stop along the top of the bag itself, then you're just going to need to trim your zipper to length, install the end stop, and then finish off the end of the zipper the way we did on the other side. You're going to want to pre-finish the two edges that rest along the zipper, because once this is glued in place, you won't have access to them. I'm going to taper off the end of the zipper so that it finishes nice and clean within the leather patch. So to do that, I'm going to remove the rib along the zipper tape, measure back about 15 millimeters or so, cut that out, use a lighter to melt the inside of that tape, and then overlap the two edges and glue it in place. Your zipper is likely going to have an end stop on it. Mine doesn't, so I overlap the leather patch by one tooth so that if the zipper pull gets to the end, the whole zipper tape won't come undone. Otherwise, I would have installed this leather patch right up against the edge of that end stop. Then it's just a matter of stitching the leather patch in place and finishing off the remaining edges. To attach the zipper to the main panel, I decided to use this double-sided tape. The reason I like using this for installing zippers is because if you don't get your zipper perfectly lined up and the teeth aren't straight, you can simply pull the zipper off, remove the tape, add a new piece, and then try again. You're going to line up your zipper tape to the inside of the corner stitch hole. Then flip the piece over, remove the basting tape from the inside, and then stick it down. Sometimes I've had this basting tape come loose while I'm handling the piece, so I like using these locating pins to keep the zipper in place while I'm stitching it. Now it's just a matter of stitching this zipper panel in place. To install the other half of the zipper on the other panel, I'm going to add the basting tape to the zipper itself versus adding it to the panel. What I'm doing here is lining up the corner of my main panel with one of the corners on my cutting mat. I can then use that corner to line up my other half. That way everything is parallel and lined up correctly. Depending on the zipper tape you're using, you may need to punch through that tape with your stitching irons. I find some brands of zippers have a thicker fabric to them, and in those cases I find it easier to punch through that fabric, creating a hole so that it's easier to stitch. A quick note on the order of operations. You may want to consider stitching in your zipper before stitching in your straps. This will make it easier to stitch in that top stitch line right to the corners before your straps are in place. The gusset panel has 3 reinforcement points. On each end, it's reinforced with some heavyweight cardstock, and the bottom has a piece of salpa which holds the bag feet and provides a bit of structure to the base. I skive the edge of the salpa leather out to 0 so that you don't feel that reinforcement or see it once the lining is glued in place. Salpa is a really good option for reinforcement. You can get it anywhere from 0.5 millimeter right up to 2 millimeters thick. In the previous series, I used Brio as the base reinforcement. It's a really good option if you're using a bit of a softer leather. Because of the rigidity of Brio, it's going to add a lot of support. In this case, since I'm using 3 to 4 ounce veg tan, I don't need that level of support or structure, so salpa is a really good option. I use the guide piece that's included in the plans to make these marks on the inside so that I know I was placing my reinforcement panels in the correct location. The last step in the gusset before we install the lining is adding the bag feet. The bag feet that I'm using on this have a compression fitting for the back post. You want about 3 millimeters of that post sticking beyond the leather so that it compresses properly and holds nice and secure. This is a reinforcement material called microfiber. It's my first time using it, and I got it for 2 specific reasons. One was for situations where I need to add just a bit of body to the leather, and 2 was for applications like this where I want to protect the hardware that's on the inside of the bag from being felt or seen on the interior lining. You can see how soft this material really is. It doesn't skive very well. And given the fact that it's only 0.5 millimeter thick, skiving it out is probably unnecessary for this application. This piece is going to live between the lining and the base support piece that holds the feet. Once that's in place, we can then go ahead and glue our gusset to our lining material. I start by sticking down the center of the gusset and then wrapping up the two sides of the lining while curving the main gusset panel. This will prevent any wrinkles from occurring on the lining leather when we go ahead and stitch this into its final shape. If you were to glue this lining flat, when you curved up the sides, all that extra leather on the lining is going to bunch up in the corners and it won't look very good. Once your glue has had time to set, you can go ahead, punch through that lining, and then trim it to final size. Where the gusset curves around the corner, the stitch spacing does change slightly, and the plans do indicate where that stitch spacing changes from the rest. For the top edge of our gusset, we're going to start at the second hole down from the corner, stitch around, and finish on the same hole on the other side. You'll also want to pre-finish the top edge of the gusset before we stitch it in place. To aid in making sure you get everything lined up correctly, your plans include reference marks for the center of the gusset and the stitch holes that match on the strap and the gusset. To start, I used 2 locating pins in the 2 center holes on the gusset. I added another locating pin just before the start of the corner. I then wrapped the gusset around the corner and then added a locating pin in the marked position from my pattern. I added another pin on that same side just before the corner starts. And then I did the same thing on the other side. And it's the same procedure for the other panel. These locating pins have become fairly essential for me in my bag making process. Because I double punch all of my pieces, making sure the holes line up when I assemble it is essential. Not only locating the holes properly, they also act as small clamps, so I don't need to use binder clips when attaching a gusset to a panel. To stitch the gusset in place, you're going to start and stop where we finished off that strap. Stitching around the corners when you've pre-punched it can sometimes be a bit tricky. If the holes aren't lined up perfectly, you do have to use your needle to kind of persuade it through, but a little bit of patience, you'll get through it. So if all is done correctly, the hole where you're going to start your stitching around the strap should line up with the hole that you finished on around the top of your gusset. The result will be a stitch line that runs all the way around your strap and through your gusset panel, resulting in a seamless transition. There are two options you have here when you're dealing with the section of straps that overlap. You can do this section independently from the main thread, or you can do what I'm doing here. I've taken one needle and I'm looping it back and forth to the end of this stitch run and then back to where I started. And if necessary, I just use my awl to persuade that thread up into the proper angle so that you can't tell it's not a technically proper saddle stitch. I then continue stitching just to the end where this strap overlaps the other. To end this run, I'm going to finish off in that last hole where the locating pin was. This hole is also marked on the pattern. The key to getting a good edge, whether it's polished or painted, is making sure that edge is perfectly smooth and flat. So my first step is using 120 grit sandpaper on a sanding block to get that edge nice and level. Any low spots in the edge will become obvious because they will be darker than the area that has been sanded. I'm also going to sand down the outside edge of this strap. Once that edge is done, I just use my edge beveler to knock down that corner. I start by applying a very light coat of edge paint to the surface. This first thin coat absorbs really quickly into the edge and provides a good foundation for the next few coats. I can then sand down this initial layer with 220 sandpaper on the sanding block. Depending on how smooth you got the edge before applying the paint, you may need to stick with 120. This first initial coat is also going to show you where the low spots are on your edge. So depending on how much preparation you did, you could very well end up removing the majority of this first coat. If that's the case, just apply another thin coat. The second coat is when you're going to start actually building up that layer of edge paint. I apply it substantially thicker than the first coat, and I'm focusing on making sure that the edge paint is applied evenly to the surface. I want to avoid any major bubbles in the edge paint that are obvious when you're eyeing down the edge. Sanding down this second coat, I use 220 grit sandpaper without the sanding block. My goal here is to sand down that edge until it's uniform in color. That will leave some spots completely sanded through, but that's okay because we're going to apply another third heavy coat. This third coat is the same as the second. Apply a heavy, even coat of paint to the edge, let it dry, and sand down with 220. The final step is adding a nice thin layer of Columbus wax to bring a bit of shine to that matte edge. I'm using the spatula tip for my creasing iron machine to smooth out that wax. You can do this with just a canvas cloth, but it takes a lot longer if you don't have heat. So that wraps up this project. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments section below. If you want to get plans for this project, you can head to my website, norfolkhandmade.com. I've also left a link in the description. And if you end up making this bag, share it with me on social media over on Instagram, norfolk.handmade. Thanks for watching, everyone. We'll see you in the next one.